Remember when America's polite, rule-abiding neighbor was Canada? The nation that apologized too much, played by the book, and never rocked the boat? Well, those days are gone, because when President Trump hurled a huge 35% tariff on Canadian imports, wagering that Canada would cave under threat and plead for a deal, something interesting happened. Canada didn't budge. We struck back harder than anyone anticipated. And the ripple effects now are transforming trade, jobs, and even international politics in ways that no one anticipated. On first impression, Washington's action appeared daring, even brilliant. Tariffs are good headlines. They read tough, authoritative, and easy to market as a patriotic victory. But beneath the politicking is a completely different story. Once you strip away the layering, examine the trade data, corporate profits, and industry research, the reality emerges. The action boomeranged. Not by a little, by spectacularly. This is not about partisan spin or political talking points. It's about numbers, cold, hard, economic data that tells a story nobody foresaw. And after months of sifting through those numbers, I discovered something that flips the whole narrative on its head. It asks serious questions. Who actually needs whom? Who ended up stronger? And what happens when Canada finally stops behaving like the junior partner in this decades-long economic marriage? We're taking it all apart. But before we get into it more, hit that subscribe button and like, because when you see the entire picture, you'll never think about this trade war in the same way again. When President Trump made that 35% tariff threat against Canadian products, the plan appeared straightforward enough. Exercise American muscle, blackmail Canada into concessions, and leave with a Washington favoring deal. It was classic bully boy politics, but there was one catch. The math did not cooperate. They heard 35% tariff and thought that suddenly all of Canada's exports to the U.S. would just go through the roof. But the truth, more than 95% of Canadian shipments to the U.S. are covered by the USMCA Free Trade Agreement. Autos, energy, agriculture, and most of the big-ticket manufactured products included. The actual weighted average tariff? Around 2 and 5%. So basically, what appeared to be a sledgehammer on paper didn't even make a dent in real life. Economists have a word for this sort of overreach, a swing and a miss. It's the political equivalent of walking up to the plate with confidence, taking a huge swing and totally whiffing the ball. The idea was to intimidate Canada. The outcome? Canada remained serene, calculating, and composed. And that serenity amplified Washington's blunder. Because below the loudmouthed grandstanding, U.S. policymakers appeared to have forgotten one important fact. America needs Canada as much, if not more than Canada needs America. And that's where it all began to fall apart. For decades, the U.S. story has been simple. Canada's the junior partner, dependent on its larger neighbor to make it economically. But if you look at the trade statistics, that fantasy disintegrates quickly. Let's begin with one basic fact. About 9 million American jobs directly depend on trade with Canada. Not Canadian jobs, American ones. We're talking about auto plants in Michigan, steel mills in Pennsylvania, aerospace factories in Kansas, and farms scattered across the Midwest, all running on the heartbeat of Canadian trade. If that trade vanished tomorrow, millions of American paychecks would disappear right along with it. And here's the piece most folks miss. Canada is not merely another trade partner. It's America's single biggest customer, by a wide margin. Each and every year, Canada purchases more American products than Japan, South Korea, China, the United Kingdom, and France combined. Aggregate all of them, and the sum still falls short of what Canada buys. And that figure? A mind-boggling $359 billion each year. So let's put that in context. If you have a business, would you pick a fight with your largest customer? Would you threaten the only partner who buys more from you than anyone else in the world? Of course not. But that's what Washington did. And by playing the weaker side of the equation card against Canada, U.S. policymakers lost something important: just how much quiet clout Ottawa actually had. When Washington turned up the heat, anticipating panic, Canada didn't crack, it evolved. Consider it this way: a business loses a key customer overnight. You don't sit idle waiting for things to right themselves. You cultivate new markets, you diversify, you make yourself resilient. That's precisely what Canada did, and the dividends have been nothing but astounding. Canadian exports to the rest of the world reached record levels this spring. Sales to Japan rose 23%, to Germany 46%, to the United Kingdom they almost doubled. These aren't minor changes. They account for billions of dollars of new trade leaving American ports and heading to Europe and Asia. But the revolution wasn't only taking place at the international level, it was playing out in people's living rooms. Consider something as mundane as wine. When American wines disappeared from Canadian store shelves during the Tariff War, something strange occurred. Canadians went local. Sales of domestic wines skyrocketed, increasing 60% in Quebec province alone. In contrast, U.S. wine imports plummeted by a record 98% from the previous year. This wasn't merely a liquor story, it was symbolic, a symbol of a greater transformation rippling across the nation. When they are forced to turn inward, people tend to find strength they didn't know they possessed. Canadian producers discovered renewed pride, allegiance, and faith in consumers who at last perceived the value in local products. What started off as a trade war soon turned into a cultural revolution, one that supported local industries and sent a shivering message to American exporters who had for so long taken Canadian demand for granted. And if there is one industry that best illustrates how Canada leveraged crisis into opportunity, it is aluminum. For years, Canada, especially Quebec, was one of the world's premier aluminum producers. But this is how it went. We extracted and processed the aluminum, sent it south to the United States, where it was manufactured into cans, auto parts, and appliances, then back north again. It was a tenuous circle of mutual dependency that kept both economies running. Then the tariff struck, hitting both sides of that supply chain. Raw aluminum shipping south was taxed. Finished product shipping back north was taxed again. Initially, it appeared as though Canada had been cornered. But rather than fall back, Canada rewrote the playbook. Ottawa and private sector teamed up, making huge investments in developing domestic manufacturing, specifically can production, the very segment of the process that had previously relied completely on the U.S. Why should this matter? Because each change in trade, each tweak in strategy, means something concrete. Jobs, dollars, and market share that used to go south are now remaining right here in Canada. By establishing its own canning and manufacturing facilities, Canada has set itself up to regain well over $1 billion worth of business that previously existed with U.S. companies. What started out as punishment instead set the fuse for a whole new era of expansion. Rather than contracting under the pressure of tariffs, Canada did the opposite. It grew. Each new factory opening, each car coming off a Canadian production line, isn't just an economic indicator. It's a badge of toughness. Evidence that when Canada gets pushed, it doesn't weaken, it gets stronger. But the battle over tariffs did not remain contained to factory floors and trade stories. It erupted onto the diplomatic front, where Canada staged one of its most brazen and defining plays in decades. In the midst of the tariff standoff, Ottawa issued a bombshell that rocked the political establishment. Canada formally recognized Palestinian statehood. Washington's reaction was instant and angry. President Trump threatened that trade negotiations would be very difficult if Canada went through with it. But Canada didn't blink. The government held its ground. And for the first time in a long time, the world witnessed a Canada doing its own thing, unapologetic about falling out of step with Washington. This was not merely Middle Eastern politics. This was about sovereignty, a message that Canada would no longer have its foreign policy dictated by fear of being retaliated against by the Americans. Canada had, for decades, been considered the faithful, quiet partner, cooperative, consistent, and ever in alignment with U.S. strategy. But that reputation was broken in that moment. Ottawa issued a direct message. The days of quiet obedience were over. Canada was not longer the junior partner. It was an independent power, capable of speaking for itself on the international stage. And this is where the relationship between tariffs and Canada becomes apparent. Economic independence leads to diplomatic independence. When your economy is wholly dependent upon one market, you don't negotiate, you capitulate. But when you diversify, when you build up your home foundations, you get the ability to say no and mean it. That's precisely what occurred here. Canada converted economic leverage into political liberty. And in a lot of senses, that change could be more powerful than any trade agreement or GDP figure. While Canada was diversifying, investing, and stepping into its independence, the numbers south of the border began to tell a different story. The so-called tough tariff strategy wasn't crippling Canada, it was boomeranging back on the United States. By the time May rolled around, America's trade deficit had ballooned almost 19%. Its exports were declining, its imports were flat, and American manufacturers were getting pinched from both ends. They were selling fewer overseas while paying higher prices for raw materials domestically. And nowhere was this hurt more than in aluminum. Prices in the U.S. soared, 80% higher in only a few short months. The effect spread throughout ordinary life. Beer cans cost more. Car components took more to produce. Appliances increased in price. And the average price of a new car in the U.S., more than $48,000, the most ever recorded. Families, employees, small businesses, the individuals who had nothing to do with the political battle, were suddenly paying the price. To the north, meanwhile, Canada was quietly escaping its historical energy addiction. For decades, almost every Canadian oil and gas drop went south. That pipeline characterized the relationship. But that, as well, was beginning to shift. But this year, something astonishing occurred. For the very first time in history, Canada exported its first LNG tanker to Asia. And the purchasers there were happy to pay 35% more than U.S. customers. That wasn't merely a sound business bargain, it was a declaration. More symbolic was the manner in which those deals were signed, not in dollars, but euros and yuan. Each of those transactions subtly erodes American influence in international trade, while offering Canada increased economic liberty and voice. With each agreement, Canada moves further out of America's shadow and into a role it's long been prepared to assume: a self-assured, autonomous player on the world stage. So while tariffs were meant to make America strong again, the truth couldn't be farther away. The bills are piling up at home. Increased prices, suffering industries, and angry customers, while Canada is secretly raking it in elsewhere. And that brought us here to the true tale behind all the hubbub. Washington sought to muscle up, hoping Canada would cave. But instead, the tariffs ignited something greater. Canada didn't just bear down against the pressure, it changed because of it. We diversified, we invested, we constructed. Today, America has to pay more, have a weaker card in international trade talks, and a North neighbor that does not fit the old junior partner description anymore. Canada emerged victorious from this battle, more confident, brasher, and more independent than ever. But the larger question remains in the air. Does this type of confrontation strengthen both nations in the long term, or reveal how tenuous the balance between them is? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you found this breakdown eye-opening. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. Because the next chapter in this trade battle, it's already being written. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.